A lot of the problem we see is that people are eating a lot of these high carb foods, which is not great for their insulin, and then coming off it. But the thing is, they're getting the outcome that they want, which is still they're getting weight loss because they're not eating as many of those foods or not as much. And so they are still seeing weight loss. And so there's no real incentive to change. It's like, well, I can kind of get away with eating these foods now, so why wouldn't I? But the risk is that then when you come off that then you're not going to have these habits in place to actually sustain that weight loss. Or if you're staying on it, and that's the general recommendation at the moment, is that you've just got to stay on it for life, and we don't know the outcome of that, but that you're also going to have really low nutrient levels because those foods also don't contain very much of anything apart from carbs. Hello and welcome to PCOS Explained, formerly the PCOS Nutritionist Podcast. I'm your host, Claire Goodwin, a registered nutritionist and exercise scientist specialising in PCOS because I have it too. Each week, we'll uncover the latest research, share inspiring stories, and provide practical tips to help you thrive with PCOS. Whether you're newly diagnosed, you've been struggling with this for a long time, or supporting someone with PCOS, this podcast is your go-to resource for empowerment, education, and community. So join us as we uncover the tools to thrive with PCOS. PCOS Explained is brought to you by our very own service, Ovi. Ovi is your go-to health service for women with PCOS. We help you improve your PCOS symptoms and prevent the long-term complications of PCOS by giving you hyper-personalised health advice based on your specific symptoms and PCOS drivers. We have a range of plans to suit your needs, from a DIY app-based program to one-on-one consultations. You choose what suits your budget and learning preference. And we offer a result-based guarantee on our Premium Plus plan, meaning that if we don't help you achieve your goal, we refund your money. Ovi is available worldwide, so it doesn't matter whether you're based in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else, we can still help you. Today we're talking all about the trendy weight loss drugs, and these may not need much introduction because the popularity of these medications, which include semaglutides such as trade names such as Ozempic and Wegovy, and the more recently approved trizepatide such as Mounjaro, which has been around for a while, but Zepbound, which is, I think was only released in November last year. The demand for these have skyrocketed, which has been fueled by celebrity endorsements and testimonials, and also just the remarkable weight loss that has been observed both in people we know, celebrities, and also in the clinical trials. So a really great topic to talk on, because I do think these drugs are incredible for some people and have great value, but also there are some downsides that we also need to be aware of as well.
Completely. We have both said, medications can be such an important tool to help us get that flywheel that we talk about going the other way, and that's no different for these medications as well. And even though they might be trendy or topical or controversial, I think, for a lot of people, that doesn't mean to say that they can't be a really good tool in your toolbox. Yeah,
totally. It's really interesting you say that controversial, because I do see that there is a lot of talk about them being the easy way out. I think it's very similar actually to what we went through a few years ago when bariatric surgery became a lot more mainstream, is that it was then a bit of a backlash, oh, you've just taken the easy way out, or seen as a bit of a failure, when actually they were really important and really necessary for a lot of people.
And I think that's because we've been told for the last 50 years that you should be able to see improvement with diet and exercise and blood, sweat and tears, hard work. If you actually put your mind to it, you will lose weight. And sure, it might work for some people, or it might work for a small amount of time, but we've seen time and time again that it isn't sustainable, and that especially when we have something like a hormonal condition like PCOS, where weight gain is a symptom of this, so it's not necessarily our diet and lifestyle, there's got to be something else that has to help us shift the needle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And while I still think there is a huge place for diet and exercise, for a lot of people they may need that kickstart of a drug like tirzepatide to really help them within that momentum. So therefore I think that they can be a great tool in the kit bag to use where necessary. I think what I see is also quite controversial is where there's celebrities that are using them just for losing about that 10 to 20 pounds or 5 to 10 kilos, and that's where I think that is a little bit more controversial.
Absolutely.
I think because there's not really that much downside into 5 or 10 kilos or 10 to 20 pounds of extra body fat, right?
I mean, there are some celebrities who were sitting in higher body weight, and that's for a health outcome or health risk point of view. That makes sense, but when it's people who are already in either healthy or even maybe like lower body weight and then still utilising maybe weight loss medications for this reason, that's probably where the controversial element comes in for sure. Yeah,
because they aren't without risk, as we'll talk about later. And I think one of the risks that we'll talk about later is this like weight rebound, and we have seen this where people gaining back as much weight as they lost, if not maybe more, because that's kind of what our body does often when it regains weight, is it overachieves in that space. And so if we're having this like yo-yo effect and weight regain effect, that can actually be more detrimental to our long-term health than not losing weight at all in the first place.
Yeah, completely. And I think as well, again, we'll come to talk about it a wee bit more. If these drugs, what they're doing are suppressing our appetite, we are eating a lot less. If we're on these for a long time, that's a long period of time where we're getting maybe less nutrients than we actually need potentially too. That's one of those extra things to weigh up with people who are maybe using them for more
cosmetic,
aesthetic reasons as opposed to just like health focused reasons. So
I
it's
definitely
not
think
to say you can't want to see an improvement in weight for an aesthetic reason too.
No,
like that's not wrong, but we are talking about the minor end of the scale.
Absolutely. To set the context of this podcast, I think that when we're talking about all these pros and cons, we're talking about it for people that are in the, and I hate using BMI as a category, but in the higher body weight range, higher body fat amount, and what BMI would classify as overweight or obese, right? Especially in that higher overweight range, not just slightly higher than normal BMI, because this is the group that can really benefit from this, but also it might be worth some of the risk if you are in that higher body weight range potentially.
Exactly. It's kind of, we're looking at weighing up the risk of being in this larger body. We know that being in a larger body or being more, I hate to use the word obese, but that is like the kind of category that it's called within BMI, and we know that with this additional body weight that can bring on a whole horde more of health complications. We know that just the increase in inflammation, the increase in cardiovascular risk, insulin resistance, all those risks, there's about 200 different conditions, even cancer, all of those increase hugely when we are carrying more body fat than we need to. So we're more talking about weighing up the risk in this kind of sphere as opposed to weighing up the risk in someone who's maybe not carrying that level of risk from their body fat.
Definitely. So going back, when we're talking about these drugs, we're talking about semaglutides and tirzepatides. Let's talk a little bit about the difference, and maybe let's just use, for ease of use, maybe different brand names, because I think this is what we're hearing and it's a lot more realistic. So we're talking semaglutides, or I'm just going to call them Ozempic, Wegovy, because those are the two probably most common brand names. And then tirzepatide, I'm just going to, actually, let's just make it simpler. I'm just going to refer to Ozempic and Mounjaro.
Yeah.
Because those are like probably the two most common brand names of the two. So Ozempic, semaglutide, tirzepatide's Mounjaro. But I'm just going to use the terms that you're probably all familiar with. So these are different, but they have very similar ways that they work. So let's talk a bit about how they work. Well, I know that we don't know all the mechanisms of action. We don't know yet exactly how they work. We know some of the ways they work, but we're still finding this out. They're relatively new drugs. They've only been around for the last less than 5 years. And so we don't exactly know how it works. I mean, metformin has been around for more than 50 years and we still don't know how that works. Which is alarming, and but it's just showing how complex our body is that we don't know all the ways that a drug is working on it. So one of the ways that it works is to slow our body's digestion. And I thought there was a really interesting study on women with PCOS recently. So
there aren't many studies on people with PCOS. So this is like a really interesting one. And one probably why I'm talking about it first, I've got it like right here at the top of my notes. If you're watching this on the video, you'll probably see me reading my laptop here. But because it was quite interesting to me that there had been this one done on PCOS. So they took a group of women. It wasn't that large. It was only about 25 people, I think. And they gave them a pancake to eat, which had this dye in it, so that they could then track how fast that pancake then moved through the body.
I think these guys were on the Monjaro, but what they found was those that were taking the Monjaro, when they ate the pancake, after it slowed how their body digested that. So it basically got to the stomach and stayed there, right? Like, whereas normally it gets to our stomach and then our body starts to break that down and then moves it into our small intestine where we absorb more nutrients from that, and then finally into our colon that forms a stool and we excrete that out. So what they found was that in the group taking the Monjaro, after 4 hours, still almost 40% of that pancake was left in their stomach, versus none in the group that weren't taking the Monjaro.
And so you can see with this why one big element of taking these medications is a decrease in hunger or a decrease in appetite. And if we are slowing the gastric emptying, we're not getting those stretch receptors firing, or, you know, when they shrink, they can kind of fire to the brain that we're hungry, and when they stretch, they kind of fire to the brain that we're full. There's lots of mechanisms that like work in satiety, but that's one piece of it. And so you can think, well, if my stomach's still stretched, my brain's not going to be telling me to eat. Think about it, if you know how stuffed we all feel like after having a big meal or whatever, the last thing you'd want to go and do is eat another second meal, right?
Or
because
anything
else.
Exactly.
Just
the thought of any food makes you feel like repulsed.
Yeah, you physically don't think you could do it. That is what this kind of creates. It reduces that desire to eat more food, makes food maybe more undesirable because you're so full, your brain doesn't want it anymore. You're sated, like you're satiated, so that you're not eating more. And so this is kind of one thing. If we're slowing the rate at which that food passes through you, it has a similar effect, I guess, to bariatric surgery. You're not eating as much because kind of like affected the way that the stomach works, right?
Totally. We've reduced the size, so now a much smaller amount is firing those same stretch receptors in a way that couldn't have happened previously because your stomach was a lot larger.
So that would have been what would have happened in like bariatric surgery, exactly.
Totally.
But at the moment with these drugs, we're just stopping that food from moving through. Yeah,
exactly.
So one other piece of the slow food moving through our body system as well is, you know how we talk a lot about if we eat something that's carbohydrate rich, we digest it, it gets absorbed into our bloodstream and our blood glucose goes up. So this process of slowing down digestion also slows down the rate at which this glucose is hitting our bloodstream. And so this is, again, another reason why we think it can help minimize insulin impact with the food that we're eating, because we're not getting as fast blood glucose rises, so we're not getting as huge insulin spikes. We're getting off that really up and down kind of steep roller coaster, and we're kind of moving back more towards that kind of gradual hill situation.
So I think that the other part of this as well is talking about the appetite, is that our stomach is not the only place that signals about appetite. Also our brain, especially the hypothalamus in our brain, is a huge place that regulates appetite. So it's also thought that these drugs work on the brain to regulate and slow that appetite as well, and that's the reason why people will be feeling a lot less hungry. Some people have said to the tune of about 80% less hungry than what they would have been previously, right? I think that we've heard from quite a significant amount of patients that's about what they would put it as, which is that, I mean, that is massive. Think about if you laid out all the stuff that we eat in a day, imagine only eating 20% of that. And I don't know if that actually equates to the calorie level, right? 'Cause I don't know of any of our patients that have actually done the calorie tracking and seeing what they were eating now compared to what they were eating before. We don't encourage them to do that, so we haven't asked them to do it.
I think one client that I've talked to said she was eating about half the amount of food that she was without it. Yeah.
But I guess as well, maybe when they're talking about like the 80% reduction in the hunger, is that 80% reduction in that food noise as well. This is another way that when we talk about the improvements in PCOS, just that if you're not hungry, you're not getting all that food noise thinking about what am I going to eat next. The drive for especially really sweet foods.
Which can be all consuming. It can take up the majority of your brain space every day.
Yeah, exactly. The other way that it works as well is reducing the reward center in the brain, and this is again probably why people aren't craving a lot of those foods either, is because they're just not getting the reward from it. So like when we normally eat, like when we eat something sweet especially, or that has that savory umami taste, then our reward centers in our brain are activated to tell us that that was a good decision that you made there. This food tastes good, or this food is high in calorie or high in sugar. It's going to increase our blood glucose quickly. That was a good choice that you made. And so it's going to try and encourage us to seek out more of those foods, which is not great if we're trying to lose weight or increase our health for other reasons and reduce sugar for other reasons, because these are the foods that are causing that to happen. So if we can actually reduce the pleasure centers in the brain, then it can stop that spiral effect of being encouraged to go and find more of those foods.
And I think we can all kind of relate to that. You know, you've had a bad day, you come home and you're like, oh, I'll treat myself with something to make me feel better, or sometimes you'll experience something really happy and you'll be like, oh, well, I'll treat myself. There is that real tie to emotional eating. And so I think, interestingly, there is some sort of, and we don't exactly know how it's firing, but there is an effect on our brain and on that reward center, and we just aren't getting that same dopamine hit when we're taking these medications from food, which actually can be really interesting. It could bring up quite a bit around the way that you were eating before and whether you were leaning on foods to support you through some of these things. And so I think this is where there's also been a bit of talk around mental health with being on these medications as well. And there is real risk for depression on some of these medications. Well, why is that? Are we not firing the same level of happy hormones, or we don't know these things yet, but it's just something to like really keep in mind, is that yes, there's a positive outcome of decreasing the reward center in terms of stopping that constant search for maybe foods that aren't considered as healthy for us, but then there's also the part about food is some things that do bring us joy in our life, and if we take away that, where can we seek that elsewhere, or what if we're not equipped to seek that elsewhere? You're not just going on a medication that's just going to fix everything. It's like there are all these things to think about as well.
Which I think is so crucial, because we're often sold the story that losing weight does fix all these things.
Or makes you happier.
Yes.
Yeah, completely. I think I was listening to another person talk about their journey on Ozempic, and they thought that should they be losing weight, they should feel happier, and they kind of checked themselves about, I don't know, 6 or 8 months down the track, and they were steadily losing weight, but they said they felt almost like numb. They didn't necessarily feel joyful about the weight loss, and that's just one person's story, so that is absolutely not necessarily the case for everyone else, but it's just interesting again to think, is this what equals happiness? Or I think they were happy with the blood biomarkers and the health aspect, but the actual journey maybe wasn't quite what they had anticipated it would be. Or it's I guess it's like you have this goal, and when you get to it you think, oh, that's it, I'll retire now, or I'll be happy, or that's that, once I've done that, that's done. But you always create more, or you always expect more from yourself, I think. So another thing to consider, it's more than just a weight loss drug. I think there's a whole horde of mental implications to consider too.
Yeah, definitely. The other way that it works is really by, we touched on this before about a bit of the blood glucose stuff, but it does really improve insulin. This is actually what they were originally designed for.
They were originally designed for diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes, right? And it was that they found...
they've actually been being used as a type 2 diabetes drug for a lot longer than they have weight loss medication. Yeah.
And this is why in some countries like New Zealand, it's still only approved for use for type 2 diabetes, not for weight loss. Whereas a lot of the other drugs now, like the Zepbound, I think that's specifically for, and I think Wegovy as well, weight loss. And so it's kind of they're sort of marketing themselves as more like the weight loss drug, whereas like the Ozempic was like its first use case was in type 2 diabetes, but they found significant weight loss as a byproduct.
So it was like an off-label.
Which for those of us who have been bleating the drum of it's not calories that are causing weight, it's insulin, it was like, hurrah, finally, like you're all believing what we've been saying for some time now, that it's insulin that's really driving weight gain, especially in a condition like PCOS where we do have this hormonal storm that's driving the weight gain.
Exactly. And so then when you, like you say, you bring in that medication that's addressing the insulin, we see as a byproduct the weight loss. So
exactly.
Completely.
But then we've also seen with this that there are other factors that are not just insulin specific, like the reduction in pleasure centers in the brain and the appetite and gastric emptying and stuff like that are also making this more effective than, say, the other drugs that just target insulin, like metformin.
Yeah.
So now that we've gone over how they work to improve weight loss but also insulin, let's talk a bit more about how they specifically improve PCOS. And as we said before, there haven't been that many studies on just PCOS. So we're making a few assumptions here, but there have been a few, so we'll definitely go into some of those studies that have been specifically on PCOS too. So the first one is weight loss, and I guess this is for those that are struggling with weight gain as a symptom of PCOS. It's probably quite unlikely that you've been put on these drugs if you don't have weight gain as a symptom of PCOS. But then again, I have seen this with many patients who are in that just 10 or 20 pounds that they would like to lose are using it, and so just be cautious about that. But also too, I've seen those that are type 2 diabetic that are using it as well. Sorry, we're not actually talking about this as a specific PCOS study. This was the most recent one that we have of the Mounjaro version of the drugs. And this was called the SURMOUNT-4 randomized clinical trial. It was published late last year in December. And what they found was that they found after 36 weeks on tirzepatide of the upper limit of the dose, 10 to 15 milligrams, this was both in men and women, there was an average weight reduction of 20% of body weight. Now this 20% sound, I don't know, you might think, what does that mean? Would that mean someone who was 100 kilos, and that was actually about the average in this study, losing 20% would mean that they're now 80 kilos. So it's a significant difference.
Significant amount.
Yeah, especially when we see in studies on PCOS them talking about just even a 5% reduction in body weight can improve symptoms and can improve insulin and other symptoms.
And when you think about that, 100% of your body weight is also made up of your brain, which is like kgs, your bones, your muscles, your organs. There's certain things we can't lose weight on. So it's like a 20% weight on fat tissue and as well muscle tissue,
Yes,
which we'll
we'll
get
talk about
into.
that, yeah.
But yeah, 20% reduction is a very significant number when it comes to weight loss. Yeah.
So that's kind of what you can expect. And this is about the same as bariatric surgery, which is really fascinating. When you think about bariatric surgery being far more invasive, far more long-term and potentially having other complications of that surgery, this is a really good alternative for a lot of people to look into.
And that's probably another really good way to kind of visualise what that might look like, because if you think about someone who you might have known who's had bariatric surgery, it's a significant difference in appearance as well, or you can really see that change. So I think when you're thinking about what does 20% maybe actually look like, or how do I visualise that, that's what you would think about someone who's had a bariatric surgery and what they look like now.
Yeah. And 20% is the average. So some people that's a lot more. So some people it could be up to 30 to even 40% reduction, depending on where they started from as well. So if it was a much higher body fat mass, then that could be higher. But also some people have no improvement and they do not respond. So the study that was on PCOS, and this was on the Ozempic version of the drugs, that was studied in PCOS women. It was a relatively small study. I think there was only about 25 women, but what they found was that about 20% of them did not respond at all to the drug, which means that they lost less than kind of 5% of their body weight.
Yeah, and a lot of that do not responders often as well, it might not be that they were on the medication for the entire time. Some of them might have found that that medication was actually too horrific to be on. The side effects were too severe that they just threw in the towel and said absolutely not.
This one specifically, they did stay on it.
They did,
and I think this definitely comes through in a lot of our patients, right? Like I'm thinking about a few of our PCOS patients that have been on it and not lost any weight. And they're like, what's wrong with me? Interestingly, in this study on people with PCOS, they found that it was the people at the higher body weight that didn't lose any, which I thought was really interesting, because I definitely don't see that in the people that we've seen. I see it not being effective for many in the mid kind of weight range category, those that I would definitely not say are at the higher end of the body fat.
I can think about one of my clients who is on Ozempic style, and she is in the higher end, and she saw improvement for the first week or two and then hasn't seen any further as well. It's the same with anything, and the same with even when you attempt a weight loss with diet and lifestyle alone, everyone has different responses or effects. So I think just be aware that it's not a guarantee as well. Like it's not a guarantee that you're going to lose this weight, but that's the average of what we're seeing.
I've actually just found my notes for the study. It was 27 women with PCOS. Interestingly, this was on the, as I said, the Ozempic side, and their reduction after 3 months was only 9%. So I think this is the difference really we're seeing between Mounjaro versus the Ozempics of the world, is 3 months, about a 10%, 19% body weight, average loss. Mounjaro 20%, so potentially double the reduction.
When you think about it, we kind of think about Ozempic kind of has one active ingredient, whereas Mounjaro kind of has two.
So two ways that it's working. Yeah. And so maybe these people that were not responsive to the Ozempic might have been to Mounjaro, but then we've also seen so many of our patients that aren't responsive to Mounjaro, even though it's double action, and even though they might be on the highest dose possible. But yeah, in terms of PCOS symptoms, weight loss is one of them. The second improvement in PCOS symptoms would be a reduction in insulin. This is not really a symptom that you would think of, like a reduction in like hair growth or improvement in cycles, but it is that underlying thing that's driving so many of those other symptoms. So it's really important to take notice of. So the way that they generally measure this is in an improvement in some of your blood markers, like your A1C or your fasting blood glucose. And these have generally been seen to improve with Ozempic or Mounjaro, but specifically, I think, the more with Mounjaro as well.
So yeah, H1C is sort of like a general...
What your average blood glucose has been. Yeah, your average blood
glucose has been for the last 3 months. Whilst this doesn't tell us whether you have insulin resistance or not, it's not as fine-tuned, which is why we don't tend to rely on it. At this level, trying to create a pattern of seeing if this comes down can be helpful to show us, well, did this help reduce the height of our blood sugar across a 3-month period? And if we do see that come down, then that's typically a great thing for insulin. Yeah,
exactly. So we are generally seeing an improvement in that. And a lot of people talk about this. You'll hear them talking in PCOS groups and stuff, an improvement in their A1C once being on Mounjaro. And that can mean the difference between being type 2 diabetic and not type 2 diabetic anymore as well.
That's the screening measure for diabetes or pre-diabetes. So oftentimes your doctor might be on your case if you do have a higher HbA1c, and kind of saying, oh, you're not healthy, or maybe you've got a higher A1C. And so what you feel like they're saying is get it down. And so, if you are seeing these improvements, it's like a scorecard. It's like, well, great, things are improving. My blood biomarkers are improving, which they are.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that we've seen is a regulation of cycles. So in that study on Ozempic and PCOS, again, small study, but 27 people, 70% of those who did respond to the Ozempic got their cycles back regular in 3 months, which is pretty incredible. So this is why we often hear about Mounjaro babies, or is because people have been able to ovulate again once on that and then go on to conceive through the, I don't know if it's regulation or what we call it, but the guideline is not to conceive while on it because we just don't know the effect of it on the baby. So this has got to be like when you stop it and then get pregnant.
Yeah, so exactly. And I think what we do know with drugs like metformin, for example, that actually can have an impact or a consequence on the metabolic outcome or the metabolism of the baby in utero. So whilst we know that with metformin, we don't actually have any research to tell us what's going to happen with Ozempic or Mounjaro. We can assume that there'll be a metabolic impact on the baby as well. So really highly recommended that you are not trying for pregnancy or do not fall pregnant on this medication. Yeah,
exactly.
And I think that's probably one thing to really consider with, and we haven't talked about it yet, but the longevity of staying on these medications. And we do see that weight regain typically when you come off these medications, which we'll go into in a wee bit. But if you're utilizing these medications and don't have an exit plan to get off them, but conceiving is something that you want to do in the next few years as well, I think really weigh these things up.
Totally, absolutely. I've definitely got that down in the cons parts. We'll go into that a bit more. The other thing we mentioned before was like the severe hunger and food noise and cravings that people with PCOS often experience, and this can be so freeing. I mean, we've noticed this. I've personally found this with just the lifestyle changes that I made for my PCOS, how significant that was in improving my quality of life just by reducing those cravings and food noise. And so this is something to not just go, oh, that's just a nice little extra. I think it's a really big part of an improvement in PCOS.
Absolutely. Like the freedom for creativity, the freedom for doing a better job at your job, the freedom for relationships and friendships and everything that can bring you joy and purpose in life is not overcrowded by 80% of your brain just focusing on food all the time.
What am I going to have next? How am I not going to have that chocolate bar? How am I going to stay away from that cake in the staff room?
How am I going to navigate this social outing with food and all sorts of stuff? Completely. So when we say it gives you brain space, that is a quite invaluable improvement.
Absolutely. And the other one that we have seen is an improvement in blood pressure and also cholesterol markers in the blood. So this is something, again, not necessarily in the PCOS study, but just in the general studies on the Mounjaro and Ozempic, is that these have been significant improvements. And given that people with PCOS are at significant higher risk of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, then these are actually really important markers as well.
Absolutely. We've seen huge improvement in terms of the cardiovascular risk, and a lot of these studies we've seen men and women, but regardless, as we said, particularly if we're in a bigger body, cardiovascular disease is a real health risk, and it is the biggest killer in New Zealand. I'm pretty sure it's still the biggest killer in the States. So it is a very real risk, and something that if we can see improvement in, that's incredible too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have some concerns about the way that they're measuring that in terms of looking at the way that they're measuring the cholesterol and stuff like that, but that's a topic for another conversation. So at the moment, we haven't seen any other studies looking into other symptoms like facial and body hair growth, hirsutism, or any other symptoms of PCOS, but I'm sure that they'll come through really soon. And I definitely have heard anecdotally from patients that they have seen improvements in those with the reduction, especially I'd say, of the insulin, because that then is going to lower the testosterone, which is then going to improve the hirsutism and other kind of testosterone symptoms. So I'm sure that if you're talking or hearing from other people, they will also talk about those specific sides of PCOS. So those are all the real positive sides. But there are some downsides that we wanted to talk about, and these are very, very real downsides, so it is absolutely worthwhile taking these into consideration when going on to these drugs, or, as you said before, having an exit plan for how to get off these drugs and maintain those improvements. So one of the things I actually didn't write down, but I just remembered, was the risk of thyroid conditions while being on them.
Massive, yeah. That's on the label, that's on the box.
So I think that's not necessarily that's just you really shouldn't take these if you are at risk of a thyroid condition, which is 25% of people with PCOS, women with people with PCOS. So just really make sure that you rule that out. And I would say if you have a family history of hypothyroidism or autoimmune hypothyroidism, but you don't yet have it, I'd be so cautious doing this, going on any of these, because you might not be presenting with that at the moment, but it might be there underlying, and you do not want to trigger that.
And at greater risk for thyroid tumours and cancers.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
You might not know you have a thyroid problem at the moment, but if you know that anyone in your family history does, especially your mum or aunts or sisters, then be very, very careful about using these. So the next one, which is more of a con of that, while these drugs have shown fantastic improvement in weight loss, so I mean 20% average is absolutely nothing to sniff at. Most of the studies have only looked at 3 months, right? And 3 months is a very short span of time in someone's life. What happens after a year, 2 years, 5 years? And this is where we start to see probably the real truth in how these drugs work. The unfortunate thing is that most of the time, most of the studies that we have and most of the following people that have been on these drugs, because they haven't been around for that long, but following those that have been on them for a while shows that these are not very effective long term, unfortunately. And that the weight loss and the improvements that you might see while on these drugs does not transfer when you come off them.
Yeah, you almost have a reversal.
So totally.
Yeah.
In that Surmount trial that I mentioned before, that was published in the JAMA journal, which is a really highly regarded journal, that was in December last year. They did a quite interesting study where they took 670 people, put them onto the Mounjaros of the world for 36 weeks. And then half of them, they put them onto a placebo for the next, until like 88 weeks. And then the other half, they kept on Mounjaro. And what they found was that there was a really good improvement in weight at the 36 weeks. So all of them, the average loss was 20%. So it was perfectly in line with what they've seen before. But when they put half of them on a placebo and then followed them until 88 weeks, what they found at 88 weeks is that they'd had a 14% weight regain. So this is pretty much, what's 88 weeks in years? Like 52 weeks is a year, so year and a half. Yeah, right. So basically that by a year and a half, even after those that had been on, they'd been on for 36 weeks, what's that, like six months?
Yeah, longer.
7 months? Yeah. So lost 20% at 7 months, but by a year and a half, actually, they'd regained 14% of that.
Yeah.
So actually the net improvement was only 5% at a year and a half.
And also we've got to think about what does that do when you lose lots of weight then regain it as well. You know,
totally.
Like that yo-yo effect.
And it doesn't mean that they'll continue to have lost 5% of body weight.
No.
Likelihood is if we followed them for another 2 months, they would have regained that extra 5% as well. And maybe more.
Again. Yeah.
And this is definitely what we've seen in previous studies of weight loss effects where, especially if we haven't developed habits that are actually really easy to maintain, is that when you lose weight, if you then regain that weight, I know you use a really good analogy. We were saying it's like the rubber band effect. Like if you ping back a rubber band, if you stretch it, because you've kind of stretched it, now it will never rebound to the size it was. It's always going to be now stretched further.
Yeah.
And so the same with weight gain is if you lose weight and then regain it, you're going to actually regain more than where you started from. So if you were at 100 kilos and you lost 20, but then now you've regained it, you're probably going to be now at 110 rather than 100.
Yeah. It's like your body almost learns, oh gosh, I'm at risk now of potentially losing some of my stored energy, which I keep on board for famine or whatever else. That's my safety net. There's been a threat before that I'm going to lose it. It's almost like your body's like, okay, well, I'm going to hold on to it and more in case this happens again.
Totally.
And we see that as well in the post-war studies and things like that, where people who were starved during wartime, like World War II, for example, when they did come back to eating normally, they ended up gaining a lot more weight. Yeah, and I think a part of that is, as you said, our body's like, oh God, we don't want to lose that anymore. But also too, because of the effects of what losing this weight on these drugs do. One of the parts that happens is that you lose a lot of muscle mass on these drugs. So a normal amount of muscle mass to lose, we always lose a bit of muscle mass, and it's called lean body mass. So it could be muscle mass, it could be a bit of bone, but this lean tissue, we always lose a bit when we lose weight. But it should be around about 25%. What they found in these trials, so especially the STEP trials, the STEP 1 trial, which was done back in as early as 2021, they found that actually on these drugs, you're losing more like 40% of body weight. And this wasn't just in one trial, it was also in so that was the STEP trial, and the Sustain 8 trial also showed a 40% reduction in muscle mass. So if you imagine that you're on these drugs for 36 weeks, you lost 20% of body weight, but 40% of that was muscle mass. And muscle mass is so important because it's the thing that uses energy. It uses... It's your metabolically active tissue. It's the tissue that demands the energy from the food that you eat. It produces energy within it. Your muscle tissue is so important for keeping our metabolism high, but it's also so important for our strength, our mobility. Are we going to be able to walk around when we're 80, or are we going to be wheelchair bound? Like all these sorts of things as well. Muscle tissue's so protective for our health in like multiple ways.
Absolutely. So if you go back to that analogy we were saying, if you're 100 kilos and you lost 20% of your body weight, so now you're down to 80 kilos, but actually 40% of that was muscle mass.
You've lost 9 kgs of
muscle mass. So it's a substantial amount of muscle to lose. And so no wonder when you go off these drugs, or in this case onto the placebo, which was not the drug, then you now have 9 kilos less muscle and lean tissue using the energy, of course it's going to be more likely that you're going to gain weight. Your metabolism slowed. Also, you don't have these drugs telling your body that you're full. You don't have them keeping the food in your stomach to tell it that you're full. The pleasure centers of your brain are now reactivated with food. And in many cases, our lifestyle hasn't changed that much.
If we haven't done a lifestyle intervention at that point, maybe the food the amount that we've eaten might have changed, but everything else might not have changed. In these studies, we're not looking at incorporating exercise or incorporating different lifestyle changes, right?
Yeah.
Sleep, all the things.
Exactly. Then it's no wonder that you're going to gain weight. Also, too, with the way that it depresses the amount that you're eating, our patients are saying 50%. So if you're going from eating, say, 2,000 calories a day to 1,000 calories a day, your metabolism now is down at like 1,000 calories a day. If you just go off that medication cold turkey, there's nothing stopping you from wanting more food like that 2,000 calories. And so now your energy has now increased by 50%, which if you eat more than 20%, you're going to gain weight. And this is part of what we're going to be teaching in the masterclass, is what we've been working with our patients who are on these drugs, about how to come off them and maintain that weight loss, how to actually implement these lifestyle changes while you're on the drugs so that you can come off them and maintain as much weight loss as you can, and also how to prevent as much muscle loss as possible while on these drugs so that when you do come off it, it's going to be much easier to maintain this weight loss.
And it's not just the weight that might regain, but maybe some of your blood biomarkers might still stay great as well, those health outcomes. Yeah,
absolutely. And what we were talking about before was your physical decline in health when you regain that weight back. But what's not talked about is how your mental health really suffers. When you've lost weight and then you regain it, there is a huge amount of guilt and shame that goes with that.
Oh, completely. And I think we feel this already. We know if weight gain is a symptom of our PCOS, the shame and the guilt we feel around the symptom and of gaining weight and feeling like we can't fix it or we can't change it. So there's that whole nother layer as well. And I think the effort that you've gone to and the ability to lose weight and the positive reinforcement you get during that journey to then feel like eyes are on you again in the other direction too. And whilst not everyone might be looking or talking about this, that's how we feel. That's how we all feel, is that everyone's going to look at this and think, God, I'm a failure. Gosh, I'm like... The shame around that is so horrendous. So I think, again, there might be mental things as we're on the drug, but there might be mental things when we come off the drug as well to consider too. And I think that's interesting. I was listening to a podcast with Rebel Wilson, and she was talking about her journey on Ozempic, and it was quite interesting. She talked about, actually, she did a huge amount on her own and lifestyle and change, and then she experimented when she kind of had a plateau with Ozempic, and then she came off it because she was having her child. And then now in this podcast, it was quite interesting. I just picked it up on it. They never really talked about it.
Did she have I thought she had they had a surrogate.
No, she went through an IVF journey.
Oh, did she?
Yeah. Oh. They talk a wee bit about that in her PCOS. Super interesting. Yeah, it was an IVF journey. So yeah, I'm pretty sure she carried it because she said after having the baby, your body's never the same.
Fascinating.
But anyway, I could hear her in this podcast trying to explain, but I had the baby, and then I've actually been working on directing this other project, and I haven't had time to work out as much as I have, and I'm not on the drug at the moment. And she almost had to apologise for why she was looking like she put on a bit more weight, or she kept commenting on, I've gained back a bit of weight. I know it won't be forever. You could tell she felt shame and guilt around it. It was just like heartbreaking to hear. We've got to give ourselves grace that everyone's bodies change across the course of our life. But of course, if you've been able to utilise, she said during her first part, which was lifestyle, it was in 2020 during lockdown. Everyone was on standstill, and she had all the time in the world to do, like she said, 2 to 3 hour workouts a day. And then life gets in the way, and then something like Ozempic might have helped, but you can't be on Ozempic forever if something like pregnancy is a goal for you. Or in other cases, there's always been issues around supply with these drugs as well, and so you might have been forced off these medications against your own will. So there's that real fear and guilt and shame of gaining weight. Yeah,
that's definitely what we've seen with our patients over the last couple of years, is supply issues have caused a lot of challenges for them. We've been trying to navigate with them about, okay, how are we going to get you off this, and then try and maintain as much as possible until if you want to carry on with it later. So it has been a very real challenge and something that I think is probably going to continue on as the demand increases all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. The demand increases. It's not to say that there aren't companies coming out of left, right and centre. Like all of the big drug suppliers know that this is the money-making ticket. Like you can see Novo Nordisk, who invented Ozempic. That was kind of the first one. Their share price and the company valuation is huge now. They have absolutely, it was a golden ticket for them in terms of this, and so every other drug provider, like Ali Lilly's the one who have done the Zepbound, that new version of like Mounjaro. There will be more drugs coming out, and they will be wanting to keep up supply because business-wise it's great for them as well. But as you say, more and more people are going to want to start experimenting with these or try these, so it's something to keep in mind that we might not be at the end of the supply troubles and dramas there. Yeah.
Some of the other downsides we've seen is nausea and gastro effects. So some people really can't tolerate it at all, and this is not something to just go, oh well, like they're a bit weak. Like no, it's like so significant that they can't stay on it. And I think one of the early trials, the one that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, it was around about 10% of people, I think, that could not tolerate the gastro effects of the drug. So it is a very real thing.
Like we know how horrific we can feel if we have a stomach bug for 24 hours, or anyone who's been through first trimester pregnancy and had pretty horrific nausea will know how all-consuming that kind of level of nausea is. And that's not even getting to the part of like we do see vomiting and diarrhea constantly for some people, and fainting or other symptoms like that, dizziness. So it would be like taking something that makes you feel like you've got a sickness or you've got a bug ongoing. Of course some people have to stop that. You wouldn't put yourself through that. You wouldn't put your worst enemy through a tummy bug like that.
And some of the drug companies do say, oh, this evens out after 20 weeks, but 20 weeks is a huge amount of time to stay feeling like that.
That's half a pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly. So that is a big thing, but also too, just the base, like the lower level of nausea can actually, and this is what I was going to say before when you touched on if your diet and lifestyle is not great while being on it, because if you've got that low level of nausea, then you're going to just be craving generally the foods. Yeah, totally, like white bread, crackers, crisps, those kinds of foods.
Our brain thinks of these foods kind of being safe because they pose low risk to being contaminated or have more bugs or things like that, like whereas vegetables have dirt all over them and God knows what they've got on them, or meat can be the same if they're not prepared correctly. So our brain actually knows that those foods are higher risk, and that's why we see that again when people are nauseous in first trimester pregnancy. It's because and they're craving some of those more plain safe foods because they are so low risk for contracting some sort of bug or virus or anything.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the problem we see is that people are eating a lot of these high carb foods, which is not great for their insulin, and then coming off it. But the thing is that they're getting the outcome that they want, which is still they're getting weight loss because they're not eating as many of those foods or not as much. And so they are still seeing weight loss. And so there's no real incentive to change. It's like, well, I can kind of get away with eating these foods now, so why wouldn't I? But the risk is that then when you come off that then you're not going to have these habits in place to actually sustain that weight loss. Or if you're staying on it, and that's the general recommendation at the moment, is that you've just got to stay on it for life, and we don't know the outcome of that, but that you're also going to have really low nutrient levels because those foods also don't contain very much of anything apart from carbs and salt and fats.
And so I think we think about this, and we talked about it earlier as well, as eating these sorts of foods because of the nausea will reduce your nutrient intake, but also if you're eating just a really reduced portion or amount of food as well, you might be at risk of missing out on like the volume of nutrients, like vitamins and minerals particularly, and fiber potentially that you need as well. I think that's a very real thing to consider. It might be something like utilizing a multivitamin or something if you are on these medications.
And that's what we go into detail in our masterclass as well, is just to how to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients that you need while eating so little, because it is so important to do that. One of the last cons is that we absolutely don't know the long-term implications of these drugs. And we touched on one there, which is that I just said that the drug company suggestions at the moment is that you just got to stay on these drugs because all the improvements are reversed within 6 months of coming off. So it's like, well, you're just going to have to stay on it, which is all very well to say. A, you've got to be able to afford to do that. B, your insurance has got to keep funding it. But C, you've only been doing these trials for like 3 or 4 years. You don't know what that looks like in 10 years' time. So one of the things we talked about earlier was that the food stays in your stomach for longer. So after 4 hours, you've still got 40% of that pancake there compared to those on the placebo where that had like absolutely been long gone out of the stomach after 4 hours. So one of the things we know with, say, for example, colon cancer is that if food stays in the colon too long, generally if you've got a history of constipation, that food staying in there for too long, is that can lead to a risk of colon cancer. We don't know anything about this. We don't know all of the potential ramifications of this. It could be that by having food in the stomach for a lot longer, we actually increase the risk of stomach cancer. I don't know. I don't know the mechanisms of stomach cancer. I'm just hypothesizing this, that we have no idea. But there's so many of these parts that you don't think of, that you don't even give a second glance to. You just say, oh, it just stays in the stomach longer. Yeah, and okay, but that's not normal. Yeah. Like, what could that mean?
Or because the drug is FDA approved or my doctor is recommending it, it's full safe, right? It's safe, yeah. Whilst it might have been FDA approved or the drug rep from Novo Nordisk or from Eli Lilly have sold to your doctor, hey, utilize this drug, this will help your patients. That doesn't mean to say that they even have a clue what's going to happen in 10 years' time. Nobody knows. We haven't seen the long-term effects of this. So I think, just really important to keep that front of mind, I guess, that we just don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we've seen this recently in the fentanyl and opioid epidemic, right? That was an FDA-approved drug, and we had no idea that it was going to cause that level of dependency. And I mean, it is horrific what this drug has done to so many communities, especially in the US. That's actually working in the mechanism that we knew about, right? Like in dulling the pain receptors and stuff like that. That's a mechanism we've known that opioids do that. Whereas this is something that we don't even know how these drugs work.
How it's affecting how it's working on our brain right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're still figuring that out. So yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think whilst it's like the golden ticket or the golden child at the moment, it's just like we still don't know. And so whilst we're sitting here saying, with the science that we currently have and the outcomes and the results we currently have, absolutely you could go ahead and use it and try it, and especially if you're at that kind of point of desperation with your weight gain. But we also are sitting here saying we don't know the outcome in 10 years time, because nobody does.
No, exactly. And so it's just something to be very aware of, that it, as you said, really easy to just say, oh well, if it's FDA approved it's safe. That does not mean it's safe long term, because the FDA have no way of knowing that, because there haven't been long term trials. All the FDA clearance says is it's not going to kill you while using it. Generally. Or there's a very, very low incidence of these really severe things while using it, not in 10 years time. So just be aware of that it does not mean it's just like you're cleared for life. This is the best information we have at the moment, is that you're probably safe. It's not going to kill you while you're using it. If you're finding value from these podcasts, then we'd be so grateful if you could hit follow on the PCOS Explained podcast. This means that not only you'll get the latest releases, but also that other people are more likely to find this podcast. That's the way the algorithm works. And we all know how important it is to get good information about PCOS. So if you can hit that follow button, it means that people with PCOS that don't know that this podcast exists are more likely to find it. So thank you so much for your help there. Now stand by for our disclaimer. The information contained in this podcast has been prepared for the purpose of providing information, including about the PCOS nutritionist products and services, and is designed to support clients' overall wellness. It is not intended to provide medical advice or designed to rectify, treat, or cure any specific medical conditions or diseases. Nothing stated or shared in our podcast is intended to be and must not be taken to be medical advice. Please seek the advice of professionals as appropriate regarding the evaluation of any specific information, opinion, advice, or content contained in our podcast.